This is another lecture of the Gilded Age Politics, a continuation of the lectures working through the national political situation in the 1890s post-Civil War. Where we find ourselves today is in 1892 with the election of Grover Cleveland for president against who had beaten Benjamin Harrison. Harrison was not a bad man, just not a great president, and Cleveland was one of the symbols of the age in a sense, and he had beaten Harrison in 1888 in that famous election that resulted in Harrison winning the electoral vote, but Cleveland the popular vote. In 1892, Cleveland runs again, and in 1892, Cleveland not only carries the popular vote, but he also, for a third time, will carry the electoral college. And so that elects him as president, and Grover Cleveland of New York State is entering into the presidency a second time. As a unique fact of history, he is the first president to serve 2 terms non-consecutively, and he's the only president to have ever pulled that off. But anyways, Grover Cleveland enters in 1893, and the politics of the 1890s are really starting to change. From the collapse of the Reconstruction movement in the post-Civil War era until about 1892, excuse me, you'd had a period of time where politics were kind of staid and predictable. The hoopla in the campaign that we talked about, say, in 1884, some of the old issues were still there. But by the 1890s, the time had passed, the doldrums were starting to lift, on and on I can go. But the old playbooks of the previous decades had started to wear out and frankly evaporate. So by the 1890s, you're really starting to see a new and important change in politics in the United States. New issues are coming forward, new disgruntlements, new discontents, new politicians, changing of the guard in some respects. Cleveland was old, but there are new who are out there on the rise, but they're in the secondary features. So in the 1890s, Cleveland's presidency is, we'll deal with this rather quickly because it won't take long. But Grover Cleveland's presidencies, his first presidency was far better than his second. His second presidency was probably best described as bad, a disaster if you wanted to be uncharitable, but he was certainly in some very, very tough times. When Cleveland takes office in March of 1893, getting sworn in on what was an icy, sleety, cold, ominous day, there in Washington, D.C., it was noted that the economy was already starting to get into the doldrums, very, very bad doldrums. In fact, actually, you can call it in your notes the Panic of 1893. Arguably, and you could say the Panic of 1893 was the worst economic disaster in the history of the United States. I don't think I would argue that personally. I still think the Great Depression of the 1930s was worse because of the length, if nothing else. But the fact is that the Panic of 1893 is only bested by the Great Depression, and that ought to tell you something. 1893, what had happened was that, amongst other things, the railroading industry had been overbuilt. Far too many railroads, far too much track, poor management, poor operations, swindlings, kickbacks, and shenanigans, and just not enough riders and just not enough freight. And so by the time you get to the 1890s, the railroads were just overbuilt, and they could not, they were just poorly managed as well. And so you're going to start to see railroads, including some famous ones like the Union Pacific, go into receivership, bankruptcy, and some go out of business. But what happens is it has a ripple effect through the economy because a lot of those railroads had borrowed tons of money against major banks, and some of the banks start to fail and start to collapse as well. So you have a banking crisis on your hands. You have a major industrial crisis in the form of the railroads. You have a farm crisis as well. You've seen products and the cost of farm products, in this case of corn and other agricultural products, the market collapses there. It is just a gigantic ripple effect through the system, and it's not going to end quickly, and it's not going to be abated quickly. And so here we are in 1893. You won't see the U.S. economy really start to recover until 1896 and 97. It's really a 3-year period, or maybe a little longer, arguably, before you see the U.S. start to come back up and out of those doldrums, those economic doldrums. But in 1893, when Cleveland is inaugurated president, he's got a large plate in front of him, meaning a plate of problems in front of him, and the question is, what do you do? The toolkit for the U.S. government in 1893 is much, much smaller, and there's less tools in the kit than there is in 2020. In 2020, as this is being recorded, the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve System has thrown money and has thrown liquidity, has thrown lots of different things at the economy to keep it from collapsing in the face of this virus that we're dealing with and is causing this part of my lecture to be recorded. But the fact of the matter is that in that time period, you didn't have a Federal Reserve. It had not been created yet. That's still years down the road. Secondly, the U.S. Treasury was small. It has influence, to be sure, but it's small. But in addition to that, it's just a nasty, nasty economic problem that's on your hands, and it's just not going to go away quickly. So you have those issues there. You have discontents in the labor field. You have discontents in the farming field. You have businesses shut down. People are scared. People are worried. Heck, people starve in some cases. So all that to say is that Cleveland's presidency is not opening well. And then about 2 months after he takes office, Grover Cleveland is brushing his teeth one morning, and he notices a sore spot on the upper part of his jaw. It's up by his rear molar on the left side. And Cleveland, who was himself a big man, Grover Cleveland was about a shade under 6 foot tall, he was about 5'10", and he was 300 pounds. Some said he looked like a rectangle walking, but he was actually pretty graceful for a man of 300 pounds and such a stature. The famous mustache, the cigars, all that sort of stuff. Well, anyways, he does like most people do when they feel an oral pain. He actually is going to ignore it for a while. And until the fact is this lump, this sore spot in his mouth grows to the point by the time we get to June of 1893. I got to get the words out. But by the time you get to June of 1893, that lump got big, and it worried him. And in fact, actually, what it does is it causes him to call his doctor in, and they take a look at it, and they say essentially he's got mouth cancer. He was he smoked cigars, but he really liked to chew them, and evidently he said it was on my cigar chewing side. He always put his cigar in one side of his mouth, and that probably was the cause of it. But anyways, all that to say is that in June of 1893, or excuse me, let me think a second, August of 1893, something will be done about it. Cleveland will announce he's going on vacation. He's going to take a trip, and he's going up to Cape Cod. He had a vacation home there at Cape Cod, and so on the presidential yacht, President Cleveland will be leaned back in a chair. He is going to have surgery performed on him by several surgeons. He is administered ether, which is essentially going to do, all it does is ether is it knocks you out. It, in a sense, makes you drunk. But it suspends you above death about that far. So Cleveland is going to get sick, or rather he's going to have this surgery, and they basically remove some of his molars. They they kind of cut him at the edges a little bit, and then they dislocate his jaw, drop it down, and pull it back. And so they can get in there while on a floating, bucking yacht in the middle of the not the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but in the Atlantic Ocean in complete secrecy. This was kept from the general public because the thinking was by the White House, and it's not probably off kilter, especially at that time period, to think that if it was announced that the president has mouth cancer, people would be saying, "Oh my gosh, the president's dying," and then you're in the middle of the throes of a crisis that has unemployment rates up in the 20% territory. It's all very bad. And so what would it do? It'd make it all the worse. And so Cleveland and the White House, they went in full denial mode, full downplay mode, full don't talk about this. And it was a secret, and you can also call it in your notes a cover-up. But in a sense, though, is that it bothers people quite a bit that he does announce he's going on vacation while the country's going to, as some might say, hell in a handbasket. But that issue, the Panic of 1893, not the cancer so much, because he's going to recover and he's going to live for another 15, 20 years. He dies in 1908, I believe it was, fully recovered. And considering the fact that you had no microbiology, unlike today where if you have a skin cancer cutout, they cut out around it to make sure they got all the cells around the skin. The doctors did, frankly, an amazing job considering what they worked with and what the limitations they had. But Cleveland's presidency is going to be wrecked by the Panic of 1893 and the economic collapse that ensues. The Democrats are going to be wrecked by it. So that's worth noting right there. So that brings us up to an important issue in politics, and some of that just is simply an old dictum in politics, is that you have to be able to, you need good timing. And in the case of Cleveland, he had impeccable timing when it came, the Democrats had impeccable timing, or maybe better said, the Republicans had impeccable timing by being out of power. Had the Republicans won in 1892, had the Republicans carried many votes in 1892, the fact is that the Republicans would have been blamed for the economic calamity of the panic and would have been destroyed. However, it was the Democrats in 1892 who had the control of the House of Representatives, who had control of the Senate, had the presidency, and won healthily. And for Republicans, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise to be out of power. Because in 1894, when the midterm elections are had again, the Democrats are going to get absolutely slaughtered politically. A Republican whose nickname was, his name was Thomas Reed. He was from Maine, and he was the Speaker of the House. Everybody called him Czar Reed, the Speaker of the House, Czar Reed. One time prophesied, he said, about this 1894 election, he said that the carnage would be so great that they would have to open they'd have to open trenches and fill it with headstones that said unknown. And then he went and snarled and sneered a little bit, and he said then the trenches would give out. Another one time he said, talking about the destruction of the Democratic Party for a period after the election of 1894, that midterm election that's going to cost 100 Democrats their seats in the House of Representatives. That was so bad, he said it was the worst slaughter of the innocents since the time of Herod. But all that to say is that politically for the Democrats, this is going to be a dark hour for them. It's not just dark because they lose so many offices in 1894. The Democrats, it's fair to remember the House of Representatives was actually smaller. I think it's about 400 or 390 seats then instead of 435 like it is today. But anyways, it was a smaller body, and so the turnover was greater all the more. So the Democrats are going to get crushed in 1894 because of the panic, because of Cleveland, because of just being overwhelmed by the situation. And people will, people are, basically were asking, is what can the government do? And the Democrats' answer was not much. But to be fair to the Democrats, in that time period, there wasn't much the government would do anyways. It was just a different era than today. That all to say, though, the Democrats have another problem, too. And this is something else as we start to transition away from specific politics in this late 19th century. And there, by the way, there were some real animosities between Republicans and Democrats. If you think that the parties have not liked each other just recently, it ebbs and flows in our history. We'll probably go through a period of time, I would imagine, somewhere in the near future where the political animus isn't quite so pronounced. Maybe what we're dealing with right now at the time of this recording, it might tamp that down some. It might not. Who knows? But in 1890s, particularly in 1892, the Democratic Party's got a real problem on its flank. It's on its, let's call it the left flank of the Democratic Party. And that is called the Populist Party, or the People's Party. The populist is the way we'll describe it here. But the Populist Party comes out of the heartland of America, over what has been called sarcastically and lamentably by many over the years the flyover country. So if you say, what was a typical supporter of the Populist Party? Your answer should be a farmer from the Midwest. Now, the Populist Party was not limited to the Midwest, but that was their heartland. That was their strongholds. You'll find populists in Ohio and Indiana. You'll find populists down south as well. But what had happened was, by the time you get to the 1890s, many of those men and women, some immigrants, some citizens, now all voters, who had lived for a generation on the plains, many of them had seen what had been a promise of a new start on the plains with cheap or free land, the great land giveaway with the Homestead Act that I talked about before. The fact of the matter is that you'll see the farm and commodity prices collapse. Beef was wrecked by some horrible droughts and blizzards in the late 1880s. All this put together, the farmers were being crushed. Secondly, you need to keep in mind, too, is you're seeing the change of America. And I made this point before, and it's been made in your textbook, that the United States is rapidly urbanizing in this time period. You're seeing people move to cities, and you're seeing immigrants move to cities. And so the balance of power in America was clearly and demonstrably shifting away from the farm and the small town and demonstrably shifting to the big city, the New York City, the Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Chicago, and so on. So that's also throwing into the mix, and that's an upset. We might, from the perch of 2020, say, you know, they should be more calm and confident. They should be more okay with change. But to be honest with you, most of us aren't okay with change. Heck, some of us right now, as this I keep saying, as this is recorded, might be very nervous about the change that is going on and what the omens portend. Well, anyways, in the 1890s, the farmers are looking around and saying, we're being left behind. We're being abused by railroads. We're being abused by big business. We're being abused by and taken advantage of by boogeymen, the banks even. You'll get that too. Quite famously, I say this quite famously, but I've seen it several times over the years. I don't think it's any textbook that you've got. But there was a cartoon, a populist cartoon, an editorial cartoon, which to me are some of the funniest and the best shorthand political arguments that have ever been done in the history of our country. I love them. It's too bad that art form has kind of taken a dive in the last decade or so. Well, anyways, this one political cartoon that was a populist political cartoon shows this big cow astride the United States. And it shows the cow grazing in Kansas or Nebraska, there in the heartland. Yet there she was, her udders were over New York and Washington, D.C., and her udders were being milked by Wall Street. Is it overly dramatic? Yeah, sure. Is it a little cornball? Probably so. But for the populist person who would have seen that, they'd have said, yeah, that's true. That's gospel truth. And so many farmers believe that they had been let down by the country, let down by the system, let down by big business. And so the populists are going to rise up and are going to try to make inroads into American politics. They create their own political party. The farmers had been discontented before. This is nothing new, in a sense, because in the 1870s you had a movement called the Grange, Grange, the Grange. But it never took off like the populist of the 1890s. And even today, when you talk about, say, Donald Trump, oftentimes associated with him is this outsider populist discussion where people say, he was an outsider, he was this or that. Anyways, that term populist is still out there. But in 1892, so that's a good year to remember. It's the same year that Grover Cleveland wins against Harrison. And so this ought to tell you that the populists are small in 1892, but by 1894, throw in the panic and the depression that comes with that panic of 1893, people are willing to listen to them more than they might have in the past. By 1892, however, back to that year, the populists are going to have a political party. It's a small one, but growing, with a whole lot of excitement and youth and vigor. And they are going to put together what is known historically as the Omaha Platform of 1892. You need to write that down. The Omaha Platform of 1892. And it is a sweeping platform. It is not just a call for higher prices for the farmer. It is a call for a reordering of society. They believe, and the Omaha Platform promotes, and this manifesto of what we want to see happen in the country goes beyond the obvious. Some would say, well, what about farm prices? Well, yeah. One of the things that the farmers are going to call for, these populists will call for in this platform, is the nationalization of railroads. Nationalize the railroads. Take them over. Run them. The railroads need to be run in the name of the people by the U.S. government. So, in essence, instead of having a Santa Fe or a Katy Railroad or a Houston and Texas Central, to use stuff we talked about in class, Union Pacific, Central Pacific, you'd have the United States Railway Company or something like that. Secondly, they also called for a graduated income tax. And so that was the first time outside of war, Civil War was the exception, that was the idea of needing a graduated income tax to distribute or redistribute wealth. They're radical. And so in addition to that, they also called for the owning of telegraphs and telephones by the government. They need to take care of that. They also believed in a distribution of the wealth, in a sense, maybe not a 1-to-1 ratio, but the farmers should get theirs. And also put this in your notes too, that they believe that land should not be concentrated in the hands of a few, but should be given and dispersed to the hands of the many who are hurting. And last but not least, what they're most famously known for is they are calling for, and this is one of the great issues of the late 19th century. So this, if you wanted to say which was a big issue, all these are there, but this is maybe the biggest for the populist. They call for the free coinage of silver. The free coinage of silver on a 16-to-1 scale in the economy. So they want to inflate the money supply, get more money in the hands of the people, drive down cost, and basically make it easier for a farmer to live. Up to this point in time, the United States government had largely been dependent on, especially in the late 19th century, dependent upon what's called the gold standard. But here, money and tariffs, and especially the money, though, is going to be the paramount issue in this 1890s period. What do we pay for, or rather, how do we mix our money? Is it going to be purely by gold, a restrictive money supply, or do we expand it out and make it very liquid, throw as much money into the market as possible, and throw in lots of silver? So one of the things that's worth remembering when we talk about this expansion of the money supply, the expansion of gold, expansion of silver into the system, is that you're going to have not only farmers in the Midwest, but you're going to have some writers who are promoters of this vision. And one of the writers who promotes this vision is a man named L. Frank Baum. B-A-U-M. And he wrote a book. You probably have seen the movie that is a famous movie. It's one of the two, it's either the first or the second American movie to be colorized. If it's not the first, the other one is Gone with the Wind. But one of those two movies, both released in 1939, are going to be the first colorized movie. The movie, of course, is The Wizard of Oz. Now, the book is titled The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And so it's worth noting that The Wizard of Oz, or The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, is really a parable, I think, on populism. In the movie, it's changed somewhat just because of the needs of Hollywood, the needs of a good drama, the needs of a camera. But if you think about it, where is Dorothy, the girl from? Your answer, if you're thinking about it, if you haven't seen it in years, where she came from was the same in the book as the movie. She came from Kansas. And what did she grow up on? A farm, a bleak farm, potentially, wrecked by tornadoes, sun and dirt and everything like that. And when she wakes up, she finds herself in a distant country after the tornado takes her over. And when she finds the Wicked Witch of the East killed, the Wicked Witch of the West is going to be her adversary. And she is trying to go to the Emerald City, where there is, as you well know, a Wizard of Oz. So just think about it as she makes her trek to the Emerald City to see the wizard who can fix all things. One of the things that's worth remembering is that in the movie, what is she walking on? And your answer should be, of course, a yellow brick road. Now, think about this. What is yellow synonymous with as far as a currency? Obviously gold. But in the movie, she's wearing ruby red slippers. That stands out. That's beautiful. I watched this a few months ago with my beloved little Caroline. And it's a beautiful contrast of the ruby slippers and the gold. But in the book, this is where the parable on populism really sets hold. What's the slippers like that she's wearing on that gold walkway, that yellow brick road? She's wearing silver slippers. And as she travels out and she meets interesting characters, one of which, of course, is the Scarecrow. Now, who do you think the Scarecrow is going to be a metaphor for, an analogy to? The answer should be, if you think about it, who uses scarecrows? And the answer is, of course, a farmer. They said, the course says, I have no brain. But the farmer does. He's smarter than he gives himself credit for. Then they come along and they find themselves a tin man. And, of course, and the tin man is rusted solid in the movie. But the tin man in the book is formerly a human being. But every time he swings his tool, every time he swings his axe, he becomes more and more of a machine and less of a human. Baum and the populists ultimately understood that if that populism was to get out of the Midwest and take hold and take root in the nation, they had to get beyond the farm, and they had to include industrial workers. And that's the main point here. They have to include industrial workers. So the idea is that the Tin Man would be that industrial worker who is longing to link up arms and go to the Emerald City to see the great wizard who can fix his problems as well, to give him that heart that he once maybe had. And then, of course, last but not least, is the Cowardly Lion who finds his voice and finds his courage, and that's probably an allusion to William Jennings Bryan. And that brings me to William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan is the hero of the populist movement and for many Democrats for the next decade and a half. One of the great political losers in American history, probably somewhat naive. He's certainly a great writer and a speaker, not a great thinker, arguably, but William Jennings Bryan, going to run for president in three times in our history, and he loses worse each time. 1896, 1900, and 1908. And there were even Democrats in 1912 who were saying, run one more time, this will be the time. But if you notice what I just said, the great hero of the populist becomes a Democrat in the William Jennings Bryan. We'll talk about that more in a second, but keep that in the back of your notes and keep that in the back of your mind. Jennings, a populist, becomes a Democrat. By the way, Jennings is from Nebraska. When he first makes his run for president in 1896, he's about 39 years old. He's a little younger than I am as we go. But they're headed to the Emerald City. What is the Emerald City? Washington, D.C. Who is the wizard? The president. The idea that the president can just snap his fingers and everything just turns out magically okay. It's one of the great lessons we all learn from time to time is that the president, even if he tries hard and is well-meaning, is not a wizard nor is he God. And he cannot just snap his fingers and make everything go away. He cannot wipe away every tear and quiet every sob. But the fact of the matter is that when we talk about the wonderful Wizard of Oz, it is a parable on populism about its successes and failures and realities and so forth. But the populists are going to make inroads into the Democratic Party. It's important to remember why it's the Democrats and not the Republicans. The Democrats in the 1890s, as they had been in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, going backwards in time, the Democrats had been rightly associated with farmers for the most part, with rural, small-town America. Less so today, certainly true in that time period. But the Democrats were the likely target and the likely threat posed by the populists. The populists would steal votes if everything went just without any adjustments. The populists would steal votes from the Democrats, and the Democrats would lose ground, probably electing some Republicans along the route initially, but then the populists would grow and become a major political party in its own right, replacing the old Democrats and so forth. But that's obviously not what happened. Most of you who are listening to this quite well aware of politics, that you have still two political parties in the country, the Republicans on the one hand and the Democrats on the other. What happened? So in the 1890s, as the threat of the populists becomes more and more real, and you start to see populists get elected in state legislatures, maybe a congressman here or there, county commissions, the populists are not everywhere, but they're certainly branching out. They're weedy, like weeds spreading out. They are spreading out and threatening to take over and take from the Democratic Party and basically supplant the Democratic Party. So the Democrats realized by 1896 they have to do something to shore up that left flank of their party and to keep people from running off and becoming populist and voting populist. And so what do? It's a multifaceted process. It's not just one thing. It frankly will depend on who or what group you're talking to. If you talk to a group of Southerners, you handle the issue differently than, say, somebody from Nebraska in the Midwest. But one of the things you're going to do in a general sense is that you're going to say on the negative side, this is the negative reasons why if you're a Democrat trying to convince wavering Democrats from going to become a populist, one of the things you'd say to a wavering Democrat would say is, if you vote for if you vote for a populist, you split the vote. And guess who wins? The Republicans. Do you want that? Why, no. That would be one way to go about it. The second thing is that you might say it a little differently, but it means effectively the same thing. If you vote for the populist, you're voting for a loser. You can't win. Don't you want to win? And most people would say politically, is if the question is, would you rather be pure or would you rather win? Most people, it probably ebbs and flows by the generations a little bit, but most people in most areas, the common voter, are going to say, I would rather win than be pure and have a candidate that I absolutely love and is right with me on 95 or 98% of the issues. I'll take a lesser quality candidate as far as his purity on doctrines and issues. I'll take that lesser candidate if he has a greater chance of winning. I'll take half a loaf, to change my expression. I'll take half a loaf of bread that I can get versus the whole loaf I cannot get. So all that to say is the Democrats are going to start throwing stones at the populists and trying to poke holes into the populist balloon. Another one, like I said, I kind of referenced the South because the South in the 1890s had some populist angles to it. One of which is that the populist would be a threat to the old Democratic majority, and one of the issues the Southern Democrats would say to those wavering Democrats thinking voting populists would say, what about your grandfather? What about your father who fought in the Civil War, who was a Democrat, an Andrew Jackson Democrat who was for the democracy, and we've all been Democrats all these years. How can you vote against your family? And for some of you, that'll sound as foreign as if I had just uttered that in Greek. But for some of you, you know as well as I do that if you walked into your house today and announced after spring break and all this or whatever, and you announced, Mom, Dad, guess what? I've decided I think I might be a libertarian, or I think I might be a Green candidate, or heaven forbid, I might be a Republican and you're a household full of Democrats, or a Democrat with a household full of Republicans. There might even be amongst the family a sit-down and intervention where they say basically, if you love your family, in essence, you will continue to vote like we do. I have known people who have talked about voting against the family tie, the family way, which might be Republican in most cases that I would know. And they say, I want to think about voting Democrat. Others were saying, I've been Democrat all my life. And this is true. This is actually a story from my area about 8-10 years ago when people started to vote Republican for the first time. And they literally had a family sit down where the old matriarch said, we have been Democrats for 100 years. Yet, because of what's happening in the Democratic Party, you have my blessing if you want to vote for the Republicans. And that was the breaking of the proverbial levee. So you're basically invoking the dead of the Civil War. You're invoking those who came before you and how they voted. How dare you violate tradition? And the populists, too, it depended on the populace, frankly, but the populists in the South sometimes were quite willing to court black voters. And in the South, particularly because in the 1890s, this is worth remembering. If you think about Jim Crow and Plessy versus Ferguson and all those separate but equal court cases or practices and dictums, they really come into vogue not in the 1870s, but they really come into vogue Southwide in the 1890s. One of the things the populists did, and they played footsie with, and it was probably bad politically for them, it's admirable on the idealistic side, but the politics didn't work, is that they courted black voters. Former Democrats, maybe some of them maybe been former Republicans even, but mostly former Democrats in the South, joining hands with freedmen or descendants of the slaves and voting together in a block. And that was an anathema to old-line Democrats and, frankly, some others as well. So the real, in a sense, it ebbs and flows. But one of the more virulent aspects of Southern race issues pops up in the 1890s, and you start to see poll taxes, literacy tests, and so forth that are designed to knock down and make sure the freedmen don't vote in any real numbers anymore. It really takes off in the 1890s. It was also a sop, as it would to the yeoman farmer, to say, hey, you're better than the old freedman. You're better than his descendant. We'll protect you. Oftentimes the reality is that the poll tax and other restrictions on voting basically kept poor whites from voting just as much as it kept blacks from voting. So you'll see a decline, a steep decline of voting numbers in the South in the early decades of the 20th century. All that to say is that it's an effective campaign. And in the second one is positively, you say you want to win, essentially. Let's hold hands together. We've got to work together. The reality is that it's an effective campaign. In 1896, the populists are looking like they're going to nominate William Jennings Bryan, but the Democrats beat them to it. So the Democrats are going to say, okay, you folks who are playing footsie with the populists, we'll give you that silver issue. We'll give you this issue and that issue, not this other one, and not all this, maybe not this nationalizing of the railroads. However, we'll also give you William Jennings Bryan. We like Bryan. He's a great speaker. And oh, by the way, we want him into our camp. And so we're going to nominate Bryan. We'll go with the silver issue. Is that a big enough loaf of bread for you that you'll stay home in the Democratic Party? So we keep the Democrats together, not split the party, and beat the Republicans in 96. And for many Democrats, that was enough. And they stayed home, and they stayed home, meaning stayed in the Democratic Party, and voted Democrat in 96. The Republicans in 1896 are going to cast about and say, well, how can we win? For them, of course, they go back to an old playbook, now modified. The playbook still is, where were you in the war? And for their candidate, the man they settle on, William McKinley. Now, William McKinley was a soldier, officer, junior officer in the Civil War, but like I said, by the 1890s, that issue of the waving the bloody shirt, that doesn't really work as much. The question would be, did you serve? And the answer was yes, that's good enough. So that box is checked. It's not as big of a box, but it's still checked. Well, the next thing to keep in mind, too, is when we talk about McKinley and him being chosen, what's that next thing? Where should he come from? Well, the old Republican playbook that worked real well, go get yourself an Ohioan and let him run. And so another Ohioan, in this case McKinley, who had been a congressman for years, and this McKinley is the nominee. Now, William McKinley this was worth noting now, William McKinley has himself a great political campaign that functions. And the mastermind behind it is a fellow named Marcus Hanna. Marcus Hanna was a little bit older than McKinley, but Hanna looked up to McKinley. It was kind of an odd dynamic. And Hanna really hitched his wagon to McKinley in 1896, and it was Hanna, the great political magician, that is going to do whatever it takes to get McKinley into the presidency. Now, McKinley goes and practices what even Biden is doing right now here in late March of 2020, a front porch campaign. Now, Biden's doing it digitally. He's putting out that stuff. He's got to lay low because of the virus. And it's just good politics, too. But the front porch campaign in 1896 is people would travel to Ohio. And in fact, actually, Hanna, who has a lot of friends in industry because he himself, before he was a political maneuverer, was in industry, and that's where he made his money at, is going to go to his political friends, his maneuverers, and say, okay, this is the moment of truth here in 96. Do you want McKinley, who is friendly to you, to be president, or do you want Bryan, who is a loose cannon and may be crazy on nationalization issues? And so the railroads, plus others, are going to give free tickets or greatly reduced tickets to people and say, hey, go see candidate William McKinley in Ohio. And so the railroads are going to give lots of tickets away and sell cheap reduced rate tickets, and a man could take his wife on a trip. It's not like take a trip, honey. You want to go to Ohio? Sure, it's a beautiful place. And they'd go see McKinley, shake his hand, maybe had a picture taken with a group, come back and say, I met McKinley and he's such a great guy. It was a great trip. In addition to that, the front porch campaign was also very effective because the reporters who followed McKinley's campaign, they got to eat at good restaurants there in, I believe it was Columbus, Ohio. They got to eat and sleep in the same bed every night. They knew the good hotels to stay in. Whereas those who followed Bryan around him, because Bryan's going to speak 8 or 10 times a day, and he's going to go on these whistle-stop tours traveling across the nation. He's really, in a sense, the first presidential candidate to canvass the nation. Well, Stephen Douglas did it in 1860. But to canvass the nation, trying to drum up votes. Well, those reporters following Bryan had to travel everywhere. They're worn out. They sleep in 2-bit hotels with flea bag mattresses, and they get bad food. So the reporting on McKinley was far more favorable than it was with Bryan. In addition to that, the Republicans pull out some dirty tricks. Bryan had a couple of set speeches he would give them, and he just basically rinse and repeat. And in those speeches, there was always these applause lines, these joke lines, and so forth. Well, the Republicans are going to hire basically, I say mind readers, that's not right, but men who have tape recorders for brains. They can hear something once and they remember it. And so what they would do is they would hear the latest speech from Bryan. And these Republican operatives, these Republican cloak and dagger types, are going to go traveling throughout, going to the cities ahead of Bryan and claim to be working for Bryan and speaking on behalf of Bryan and give Bryan's speech. Bryan shows up a few hours later, and the crowd hears the same speech twice, and it falls flat. So there was sandbagging there. But ultimately, this 1896 election is going to be the decision point between, is the Republican Party going to maintain its status as the number one party in America, meaning the majority party in America, or the Democrats, a new Democratic Party, a new Democratic majority going to emerge? And it always hinged on this. Ultimately, you boil it all down and down as this. Will the farmers and the populist types, will they be able to fuse, weld together? Will the populists be able to weld together their ideas and attract enough industrial workers? Because as the nation changes, the United States, remember this, is not just urbanizing, but it's industrializing rapidly. Those farmers, can they make common ground with the industrial worker? For some, the answer was going to be clearly yes, but will it be enough? Is it enough? And by 1896, that panic of 1893 was clearly ebbing. It was clearly on the downhill slope, meaning life was returning to normality. Jobs were becoming not bountiful, but jobs were returning. People were getting paid. The unemployment rate was clearly dipping. They didn't take statistics like we do today, but it was clearly the country was getting better. And so Hanna and his political operatives in the Republican Party, who were also in industry and the management side, made it clear through various methods that to the workers, they said, oh my, and some of it was as simple and as arguably underhanded, but this is politics, not a model debating society. But in what they would do is they would have these two managers, mid-level types, would have a conversation around some blue-collar workers, some just industrial workers on some floor, say in Buffalo, New York or something like that. And they would say, they'd be talking to each other quite unguardedly about, man, I hope McKinley wins, and if McKinley wins, we can keep expanding, and this economy is going to keep going. My gosh, I really support McKinley because I worry about if Bryan will. And then the other guy would answer, well, if Bryan gets elected and he goes crazy, we're going to have to furlough workers again. We're going to have to cut wages and hours, and this gets around. Basically, the warning was through the industrial workers was it wasn't like a gun to the head warning, at least not obviously not literally, not like in Russia. But the idea was this: if you value your job, you stick with the Republicans, you vote Republican, and you will get better. Your life will get better. And oh, by the way, for many it did. And so the Republicans in 1896 are going to win. The Republican campaign was ultimately, though somewhat more sedate, but it was in some respects a superior campaign to Bryan's campaign. The populist moment, it was there, and in a sense it goes poof and is gone. The populist party disintegrates after 1896. It's no longer to be found. Bryan will be forever a Democrat. The populists that had played footsie or became populists, they migrate back to the Democratic Party, and the hope still remains is, can we weld together the industrial worker and the farmer? The only person who's going to ever be able to successfully pull that off and make it that welding stick is actually Franklin Roosevelt, and that takes a panic or a depression in 1932, 29, of course, with the stock market crash. All that has to take place. But in order for it to happen, you have to have this calamity. But from 1896 until 1932, effectively, the Republican Party more or less will be the majority party in the United States, with a few hiccups and exceptions. But for basically the next generation, 1896 was the turning point, the pivot point in American politics. Though, that all to say, though, is there's still some important contributions from the populists. Some of their ideas will take different forms, but it'll essentially be the same. It'll take the form of what's called the progressive movement, which we'll deal with in a future lecture. So anyways, that concludes this lecture for the day. Have a good day.